Hello everybody, and welcome to this Autodesk Media Entertainment live webinar presentation. My name is Craig Barr. I am a technical marketing specialist with Autodesk within the Media Entertainment division. Today we're going to be talking about PTEX Painting in Autodesk Mudbox 2014. And before we start, I want to point out, if you are a current Mudbox 2014 user, Service Pack 1 is currently available. I have an entry up on my blog, the Mudroom, which is available on the area via Autodesk. Or you can just simply go on to any search engine, Google for example, and type in Autodesk Mudbox 2014 Service Pack 1, and it will guide you to the proper location to grab the patch as well as see any of the current updates and fixes that are available. So let's begin. Let's first take a look at what PTEX is. So what is PTEX? PTEX is per face texture assignment, so thus the name PTEX is shortened form for per face texture assignment of texture coordinates. It is a UV-free or UV-less workflow, and it provides a very uniform, balanced, and smooth texture layout. So the underlying coordinate system that is happening there allows for artists to avoid common problems such as seams, distortion, non-uniform or unbalanced coordinate areas for texture placement. The nice thing about working with PTEX as well is there's no need to wait for UVs. PTEX implementation of Mudbox allows you to start painting within your texture pipeline. Even if your asset does require UVs, you don't need them to begin. You can start painting completely UV free. Wait for the changes or whatever's happening with that asset to come down the line with the UVs prepared for you, and you can always transfer all of your painting and art history onto the finalized UV mesh at the end. PTEX is production proven. It's developed by Disney, and it is the Disney and Pixar exclusive pipeline. The render support is increasing. Examples include Pixar RenderMan, Mental Ray, V-Ray, many others. And development is ongoing. Next steps include ongoing research within game engines, so there's a lot of interesting things happening with PTEX. Let's just do a really quick brief history. So PTEX is a texture mapping system developed by Walt Disney Studios. What Disney required was a film quality coordinate system for their texturing pipeline. It needed to be general in the sense that any asset or any model could utilize this system in the way that it didn't matter how different the geometry was. The requirement was that a nice uniform coverage of texture would be applied and would be available. It needed to be efficient. The nice thing about a lot of PTEX implementations are that many file format or many channels can be stored within a simple PTEX format as well. And set up free. As you'll see in a moment, setting up PTEX on a mesh requires very little time and effort. It's very simple. It's an implicit operation, and what we mean by that is that it operates in a very similar sense. If you're familiar with subdivision, and if you're familiar with subdivision in Mudbox, you'll be very familiar with the way that you'll see PTEX work here. What's going to happen is that it's going to look at each face of the low-res polygonal mesh, and it's essentially building a per-face texture coordinate system on there. So as you subdivide, you're actually getting some nice clean texturing workflow going in there. And we're going to take a look at that live in Mudbox here in a moment. So what got things going here was all the research and development going on at Disney, and two very smart individuals, Brent Burley and Dylan Lacewell, wrote the paper PTEX Per Face Texture Mapping for Production Rendering, and that was released in 2008. Disney's Bolt was the first feature film to use PTEX back in 2008, and then in January 2010, the great guys there at Disney released PTEX as open source. So it is still open source, so lots of opportunity for development to happen there as well. So PTEX takes away this wonderful, joyful bliss of UV layout. I think these images kind of summarize what we've all gone through at one point or the other with laying out UVs. There are portions of UV layout which are fine and not a big issue, and there are complicated, complex areas of a mesh which always provides a lot of frustration. Ptex avoids a lot of this here, and we're going to see how. So let's take a look at some of the workflow pros and cons, UVs versus Ptex. So some of the cons related to UVs, time-consuming layout. So UVs, as we know, can be very time-consuming. Complex shapes are difficult and tedious to lay out. So if you have something that has a lot of overlaps or a lot of something that really needs to be unfolded, or is something that is very complex layering of geometry over top, it can be very complicated and very time consuming to lay that out. UVs are also prone to seams and distortions within texture maps, which leads to the next point here, very prone to back and forth coordinate fixes. So whatever your application is that you're working or painting or editing your textures in, if the coordinate layout on there is poor, you're always going back to your content creation app where you're going to have to tweak or fix those UVs. So there's a lot of back and forth quite often in a pipeline to fix UV issues. And the last comment here is just simply a general kind of comment here. Backwards. In some cases, in quite a few cases, building coordinates for a texture that does not yet exist. And this is quite often what happens. We'll take a model, we'll lay out UVs to the way that we feel it should be laid out, and we'll start texture painting it, then we'll realize, wait a minute, I wanted some specific detail over here, I wish I'd laid this out over here. So that is kind of interesting, right? We're laying out UVs or a coordinate system for a texture that doesn't really even yet exist. So the nice thing about Ptex is that you can avoid all of that. And even if you do need UVs in your pipeline, you can come across these considerations while you're painting with Ptex and then worry about laying out UVs at a later time. Or let somebody else in another department worry about that. Pros with UVs. Variety of texture formats. So with UVs workflow, it's unlimited really for the texture formats that are available, from proprietary to the normal formats that we see in feature film and game production pipelines. With UVs, a variety of render engines exist within the film pipeline and as well with game engines, commercially available or proprietary. UVs have been around for a long time, since the dawn of early texturing, so there's a lot of development that's gone on there, of course. Ptex is much more earlier to the came along a lot later. It's a much more early history here going on, so there's not as much development as of yet, but there's a lot happening right now. And then also the pro with UVs, fully editable and paintable in other 2D applications. So having that layout or that format of that coordinate system allows for editing in things like Photoshop or Sketchbook Pro or GIMP or whatever you prefer to use as your 2D application of choice to edit or even paint further in there. Very simple layout that you're familiar with your mesh. Ptex, as we'll see, lays out in a very different coordinate system. So pros and cons with Ptex. So some of the cons: limited editing in 2D, as we talked about there. There are a lot of sorting restrictions in the way that textures are packed. Geometry and textures are linked, so that a mesh that is prepared for Ptex, those Ptex files, those .ptx files that are created for it, that are holding all the texture data, are linked to that geometry. So there is limited interchangeability there between meshes with Ptex. Rendering support is much less than UV formats, although, as I said, it is growing, and we're seeing a lot of research and a lot of other really interesting areas going on as well. So the Ptex Pros, it's setup free, no tedious preparation, very quick and easy to get going. Excellent way to just start painting. Even if you have a UV pipeline, you can't go wrong with just starting to paint with Ptex. Get the ball rolling, and then you can always transfer all that paint information over to your UV prepped model later on. Film quality, it's very smooth, very seamless, very uniform across the mesh. It's efficient. It actually packs with less wasted space than UVs. If you have a mesh that has a lot of faces on there, that you can lay this Ptex out and actually pack up the texture space or the coordinate space much more efficiently, much less empty or black space than UVs will often give you. And the nice thing about Ptex as you're painting is that you can change local subdivision or local resolution on the fly. So here's Ptex. Here's an example of some Ptex packing. The way it's going to pack by per face within its area there. So this is often what Ptex looks like in its layout. Kind of quite nonsensical when you look at it compared to a traditional UV layout where you can see specific details or features of a mesh. So Mudbox tools for Ptex workflows. We're looking at Ptex as it relates to Mudbox here today. So Ptex Prep, very simple, very intuitive, very easy to use Ptex preparation UI that we're going to see here in Mudbox in a moment. And after that, once your mesh is set for Ptex, prepared for Ptex, all the paint tools, all of the layers, the unlimited layers, the blend modes, any kind of extraction, all of that workflow with painting all work the same as with UVs, nothing different there. And then we have transfer paint layers, which is excellent for, as I said, this Ptex to UV workflow, or vice versa, UVs to Ptex, or UVs to UVs, or Ptex to Ptex, whatever it is that you need to do in transferring art history, not just baking, but transferring all that paint and all the history there to another mesh. The Gigatexel engine, which allows for a buffering of large texture data. And that is very powerful when you're working with really high resolution texture data, especially with Ptex. If you're working with uber resolution, very finite detail, the Gigatexel engine will essentially cull out or buffer out areas that you don't need to see as you're working with, and then bring it back in as you tumble around and work in those areas. Mudbox and Photoshop work very well together. I always think of Mudbox as an extension of Photoshop and Photoshop as an extension of Mudbox. And although it's limited with Ptex, you're not completely devoid of using Photoshop here. So we're going to look at how we can use Ptex with Photoshop as well to do some things here. And of course in Mudbox it brings true 3D painting. So you're painting on your very high resolution sculpted mesh or very detailed mesh, and you're getting brushstrokes that are following all the contours of the finite surface, the actual geometry. Painting and sculpting tool set go hand in hand with that point I just made there. You can sculpt and paint at the same time. So while you're painting, you can actually sculpt and adjust or change your mesh. And as well, you can go in and paint or change painting while you're sculpting back and forth. So the tool set works hand in hand together. Stencils and stamps, of course, work the same way as with the traditional UV layout workflow. The default stamps or any of your custom stamps or stencils that you want to bring in, any kind of texture library that you want to work with. So Mudbox has unlimited texture channels. Here's a list here of them. We're going to take a look at a very quick kind of overview in how we can work with these channels with Ptex and some of the different things that we can do in this workflow as well. Layer masks are available for all unlimited layer masks, and 27 layer blend modes, which are compatible with Adobe Photoshop. So Mudbox and file formats. Very simple here. The textures in and out. I'm not going to get into all the different texture formats. We're focusing mainly on the third from the bottom today, Ptex. And that is actually a .ptx format that we'll be looking at here. And that brings me to the last slide before we jump into Mudbox here. We're going to take a look at the end here with working with Ptex, and then just a very quick simple example of transferring to the exact same mesh, but now it's laid out in UVs. It came down the pipe maybe late, but we have all the painting done so we can transfer it over. We'll take a look at that here. So I think this slide kind of sums that up. Bring in the UVs, aka bring out your dead if you're familiar with Monty Python. That's simply what this slide states here. So let's jump into Mudbox and take a look. So here we have this mesh here. This is this work in progress creature, just kind of a concept creature. He's a rock scrambling kind of creature, these big kind of hardy feet and kind of hand-like appendages that he can kind of jump and crawl and scramble across rock-like surfaces. And you can see he's a riding creature here. So he has some interesting things going on with his tusks and his kind of shielded head, crested head. Let's take a look at how we can Ptex Prep the model here. So I'm just going to isolate the base body here. This is actually the sculpted up mesh. And what we want to do when we start to Ptex Prep, I have the cavity ambient occlusion on. Let's go back to our layers here. I'm just going to make sure that my mesh is active here. And if I drop down to the base level, whenever we Ptex Prep a mesh, we want to drop down to our base level of our mesh. Level 0 is around 3800 polys here. And then in Mudbox 2014, we have moved some of the menus around, so you'll see UVs and maps. I'm going to go to Ptex Setup. And you're going to get this for the first time. If you haven't used this before, you'll get how to prepare your mesh for Ptex. Couldn't be simpler. And this will give you a simple overview over this. You can read that if you want. I'm going to walk you through it here really quickly. It's very simple. What's happening here is that we have this kind of grid or a kind of checkered pattern available on here. Now let's step this down to a lower resolution so we can see what's going on. So at a very ultra low res, this is going to work maybe way out here if we're going to be working with our camera from that kind of distance. Well, we want something more high res here. What we're looking at doing is lining up the jaggedness or getting rid of the jaggedness on these blocks here. And this is going to give me approximately what that texture resolution is equal to compared to the texel layout of Ptex Prep Mesh. So as I hit increase, we're going to see that resolution increase there. Now you can see this is starting to get a little better, but still quite jaggy. So we're going to increase that a little bit. You know, we might want to bring the camera in, depending on what our production is or our rendering workflow is, into around here. So we might even want it to be a little bit more than that. And for this example here, I think that's going to be more than enough. You can see that we can actually get in quite tight in there. And the interesting thing about this is I can go back and forth. So I can crank this up really high, or I can simply come back here at any time. And the nice thing about Ptex is that it's dynamic in the way that as we paint, as you'll see in a moment, we can change the resolution in local areas as needed. So I'm going to hit done on that. And it's going to take a moment, and now the mesh is now prepared for Ptex painting. If we go to our UV view, it's going to tell you you're using Ptex. There are no UVs available to view in that window. So let's start by stepping back up to our subdivision so that we can work with all the true detail on this mesh here and take a look at some of the painting that we can work with. I'm just going to grab the paintbrush and let's create a new layer. If I just either tap on here or go to new layer, if I tap on here, it's going to ask me what kind of paint layer I want. I'm just going to create a default 8-bit Ptex file in my diffuse channel. So we'll create that. And then it's going to give me a paint layer here stacked underneath our diffuse channel. What I want to do first off the bat is start to pick a base color that I might want to work with. So maybe something kind of in a, let's work with something kind of in an orangey brown. That'll do. And then if you come down here in Mudbox 2014, we've always had flood from camera. We now have flood paint layer. So I can now just simply quickly flood on a simple layer there. And I can keep doing this and blend those colors between or do whatever I want, mask out areas, whatever it may be. So let's start out with something simple like this. One of the other things that I typically do whenever I start out here is grab an ambient occlusion map. So we're sitting here at our top level of subdivision on this guy. Let's grab this and go into extract texture maps. I'm going to create a whole brand new operation. We'll do an ambient occlusion map. Just for this example here, I'm not going to go too crazy on the resolution of it here. I'm just going to show how this works. So I've defined my target mesh, which is the same mesh here on my source model, which is the highest level of subdivision there. We're using level 5. And because it's the same mesh, I'm going to use subdivision. We can do this between completely different or arbitrary meshes, but because it's the same mesh, I can use the subdivision method. I'm just going to put this down to the fast output map here just to show what we're working with. And once I change this, we're going to ignore this here for a moment. Map type, I don't want a texture. I do want it to be Ptex. And now you'll see that these things have changed here. Texel distribution. I want to change it to how I've set it up for Ptex. So I'm going to use Ptex settings on there. And then my file name, we'll just stick it in the default, my default prefs directory here for now. call this Rock Scrambler or RS AO base, because this is just a simple base that I'm going to apply for that. And let's put this down just to a simple 8-bit integer, and then we'll hit extract on that. You'll see in the bottom left hand corner the progress as we go, and this will just take a moment to extract that texture map. And once we've brought that texture map out, we'll bring it back into our diffuse. I should point out that with a lot of maps, ambient occlusion, normal map extractions, you can check to have those in a UV layout come right back in automatically into your workflow so that you can preview them here. This is the Gigatexel engine here I mentioned in the slide there, culling out areas here. Once I start to zoom in and to that area, you'll see it'll bring that right in. Let's bring in that map now. So I want to use, I just went up to here and clicked on here, the little arrow on top of our channels or our layers. I'm going to go import layer, and I'm going to bring that simple AO format in. And what you're going to see here is the ambient occlusion map. You can see that we're getting some of the darkened areas there with some of the details. And this is a very simple base ambient occlusion map. Now, if I went in and started to tighten a lot of the filter on there, just to show, there is something on my blog in there that is working with a texture format, but exact same idea here. If I go down to, let's change this to PTEX, and if I start to work with this filter here and I make this smaller, the smaller this number, the finer the detail that you're going to get in your ambient occlusion. So you can actually get a cavity map out of there as well. For now, I just want a general ambient occlusion map, and in my blend modes, I'm going to hit multiply on that. So I've just simply multiplied over some of the general ambient occlusion, and I think that's a great way to start painting with. You're starting to paint in context to some of the details on there, and like I said, I could go back now and get a very tight, detailed cavity map, but for now I'm going to leave it as this to work with, and I'm going to create a whole new layer. And we're going to take a look at an interesting brush here we have in Mudbox, the dry brush. So anyone that's familiar with painting, whether it's on canvas or on clay, any kind of sculpture, any kind of creation there, it's probably going to be familiar with dry brushing technique. And we have this dry brush here in Mudbox, and what that'll allow me to do is to pick up the high areas or the inversely just the low creases here. So if I take this brush here, let's see what our fall off's at, that's fine, and I start to paint in here, it's actually getting a lot of these areas I don't want in there. So let's undo that, and I'm going to show you a tip here. By default, go to the Windows Preferences here, come down to the Paint pull down. By default, you'll see Fast Dry Brush turned on. The dry brush can be a bit intensive, especially over really detailed meshes. So by default, Fast Dry Brush is clicked on. Click that off if you want to get into these real detailed areas here. So let's take a look here, for example. You'll see now that I'm getting just the higher areas. So even along this valley, you can see that at this kind of valley along his muscle there, I'm just kind of getting any of the higher areas in here. This is really useful for painting up, you know, these kind of detailed scale areas. Really nice, quick way to do that. Okay, so enough on that. If I jump in, throw in a new layer, and let's grab a just a solid black. It can be any color. I can always adjust it later, but we're gonna do solid black. We do the exact same thing, but I'm gonna hold down my Control key this time. So what that's gonna do is the exact opposite. So we're just getting the lower reaching areas. Go ahead and make it opaque, because you can always adjust the opacity or in the blending mode of this. But here's something cool with this now, right? So I've just grabbed the lower areas. We have the upper areas. Of course, I can adjust the opacity on this if I don't want it so opaque. Let's actually turn that one off. And you can see now that we're really highlighting those scales just by grabbing the lower area. Where this is really useful is if I drop down another paint layer. Let's turn this one off for a second and just use a regular paintbrush just to illustrate this really quickly because I'm running low on time. Let's hit OK and just paint, solid paint over here, right? So that we have this kind of area all solid paint. Well, if we take what we've created here previously and I just grab that and drag it right on top, so when this layer is highlighted in yellow and let it go, it now effectively becomes a mask. So you can see that we've used that kind of dry brush inverse, holding down my Control key to get those inverse areas as a mask. And if you think about the availability here for that, So dry brushing technique to get the above areas, dry brushing technique to get the lower areas, and dry brushing technique just to create a mask so that you can paint in any way you want. There's a lot of flexibility to grab those lower areas or those higher levels areas and just focus on that to really create or bring out details. Anyways, enough on that. Let's switch over to a more refined or more work in progress painting here. In this case, we're just going to work with the saddle. You can see that I have isolated here the saddle with the reins and all of the hardware set up. I just want to work specifically with this main saddle area for this example. So I'm just going to right click over top of the saddle, and you'll see that at any time with these marking menus, once you become used to it, you don't need to right click and swipe around. It becomes muscle memory. You can just swipe towards what you need there. So in this case, I'm going to select isolate here just to isolate out the saddle. What I want to do is look at how we can work with some ornate detailing with textures in a couple of different ways. So one way by editing stencils or the shape of stencils before applying them here in Mudbox, and another way by utilizing all of the power of Photoshop outside of Mudbox in conjunction with our PTEX painting. So let's drop down a new layer on my diffuse channel. I'm just going to leave it as a default PTEX 8-bit file here, and I'm going to bring the view around to something like this, and I think what we'll do is we'll work in this area just to add some sort of simple kind of detail along the bridge or the ridge of this back of the saddle here. So underneath my image browser I have a bunch of different sample images. I'm going to take this simple little kind of tribal design and I'm going to bring it in as a stencil. Now you can see these icons here. If I click this icon, it's going to bring it as a stamp. I'm going to use the set stencil icon, and that's, you can see on the right hand side that it's activated that as my stencil image. Back to the 3D view, you'll see our stencil image in there as well. Just to give you a heads up or any kind of tips here, at any time if you want to set how the stencil is going to behave, all of these controls here are on the right. Sometimes you might not want the visibility to be as powerful as this, so you can certainly tone it down so that you can see or paint in context to what's going on behind the stencil. It defaults to around 3/4 here. As well, you can simply click and invert the values here if you want to work with the inverted value of that. Now I should point out, once I'm inside my tools and I'm working away, I can use the hotkey here, S, by dragging around the stencil, Q to hide or unhide that stencil. But if I want to get back to those stencil settings, the easiest way to do it is back in my image browser. If I just grab that stencil and just hit set stencil again, I will get all the properties there. If you need to come back and adjust any of these things, for example, using tiles or tiling the stencil out as well, if you wanted to do that. Let's continue on. So I want to take this simple kind of detail and apply it along this saddle, but I want to change the shape of this stencil here. So we have a couple ways that we can do that. If I go underneath the edit menu, I can go down to the edit stencil. Now edit stencil, just to explain this really quickly, this allows you to use these sculpting tools, primarily tools that can work on a 2D plane, to augment or change the shape of your stencil before projecting. So the tools that you're typically going to use in doing this are the grab, pinch works excellent for spreading apart a stencil or actually tightening up certain areas. In this case I'm just going to work probably with grab here. The display for edit stencil, it's going to default to show you this transparent version here. You can change it so that you're getting kind of the back full version, or almost like we saw with the inverted values there, and then a full opaque version of it. I'm going to use it to display it as I want to work with it in this sense. So I'm going to use the grab brush. Now let's move away from this saddle here just so that we can take a look at focusing on this stencil. The reason why I want to do that is essentially you're working with a piece of geometry here. I just hit W for wireframe, and you can see the wireframe representing the full shape of that stencil. So at any time when I'm working, I can take a look at the actual geometry. And this is important because we can subdivide this to edit the shape of the stencil. So let's grab the use the grab brush here. And then if we take the grab brush here, I can turn on my simple mirroring on this if I want to get some mirroring. You can see that this stencil isn't set up right on 0 for mirroring right along the axis. That's fine. I'm not going to get too specific with this anyways. And then what we're going to do, I'm going to use my B hotkey just to adjust that. And we can just start to adjust the overall shape of this. If I bring the brush up really large, let's start to just kind of augment this a little bit, change it around, just get the shape going here a little bit. And again, like I said, if we take the wireframe on, you can see what's happening in there. And at any time, if I hit Shift D, I'm actually subdividing that a little bit further so that it's going to give me a little bit more smooth kind of control. And essentially, you're sculpting this in a 2D sense. So you're working with this kind of in a 2D format here. There we go. Let's leave it like that for now. And turn that wireframe off. And when you're finished, you have a couple options. You can save that new texture out, or just hit Done and continue to work. In this case, I'm just going to hit Done. Back to my Paint Tools tray. I'm going to use the paintbrush, and let's just reposition this into here. I'm just right-clicking to reactivate my active geometry. I'm going to turn the mirroring off, and I've dropped down that new paint layer that we're going to work with. So using my S hotkey, we'll position this here. Maybe we'll even turn it around this way. And then what we can simply do is I could flood from the camera or just quickly paint right across in there. Now the nice thing again about painting within Mudbox is I don't really need to care much about the color that I've applied this texture here. I can come in at any time and adjust the color of this using any of these tools down here or using my right click adjust color. We'll get into that here in a moment. But what I can do with this right now, if I wanted to, we can do a bunch of different things. I could, as I said, we'll bring out a little color on that. Let's actually duplicate that layer so that we're just going to preserve it. I'm going to shut that one off for now. But I'm going to take my copy, and what I'm going to do with that is duplicate this, or we have duplicated. I'm going to move it into a bump map down here so that you see that we're getting this kind of raised kind of inlaid design, ornate design on there. And then we could come back to this here, like as I said, and we could start to maybe play with some of the blends on there, maybe bring down the strength of that a little bit, just to kind of highlight or bring that up. And of course we could duplicate that and create a spec map there as well. Let's leave that one alone. I'm actually going to turn that one off for now because we're going to drop down a whole new paint layer. Again, I'm going to leave this as 8-bit. And we're going to work with Ptex the way that we've painted here. But now we want to work with the warping tools or all the transformation tools to work with a texture or a stencil that are available in Photoshop. So let's do that. And the way that we're going to do that, again, I've created a whole new paint layer. I want to center my object the way that I would like to project the object, or the texture in this case, onto this. So for example, I want to work in this specific area. I want something to be projected onto here that I can work within Mudbox. So I'm going to use this setup as kind of a top-down view. And then I'm just going to come over to the File menu, and you'll see Export Screen to PSD. And if you're doing this quite often, the Alt and E hotkey will do this for you. And then Reimport is Alt-R for reimport from PSD. But once we connect or establish a live connection here with Mudbox and Photoshop, we can go back and forth and just keep refreshing if we want here. So let's take a look at that. So I'm going to export my screen to PSD. By default, it's going to be the my viewport width and size that I'm using here right now. Let's make it something a little larger. So I'm going to put it quite big there. And then we'll export this to PSD. Let's give this a name of just saddle. It's going to write out the PSD format. Again, we're grabbing a bit of a larger image there. And here's what we have. So just to quickly explain what you're going to get over in Photoshop, you're going to get all of these layers here, all of them being locked except for one. Now what's happening here is this is the background that not only represents your viewport shading, but it also has this number in here, this number set. That represents your camera position, or the position of your geometry as it relates to the camera within the viewport. So that's important. All of these things that are locked for a reason. Do not edit or change those. They're simply there for reference. So in this case here, of course, I can turn the visibility of any of these off. Here's our texture layer here, just representing the actual textured area, and this is Mudbox shading. So this is exactly the same as if we're working with flat lighting essentially in here. So this is just showing you the overall shading in the viewport. And this Mudbox texture, this is where we want to paint. Well, I do have this kind of ornate tree that I want to work with. So I'm going to grab Control A, Control C, and let's bring it right in here. If I hit Control V, it's going to create a whole new layer for me, and that's fine. Whoops, I want to work with this guy here. And I'm just going to position this very quickly and loosely into the general area that I want to work with. So I'm just using the simple move tool for this. That should be fine. Now what we're going to do with this is we want to edit this a little bit more. So I want to make it fit into this a little bit differently than the way that it exists right now. So I'm going to zoom in on that. And then underneath the edit menu in Photoshop, we have all these amazing transformation tools here, right? Skew, distort, perspective, warp works amazing with the lattice around there. I want to use the puppet warp tool. And what puppet warp's going to do is essentially create like a piece of geometry here, or a mesh out of my texture. So I can start placing pins or anchor points to allow me to work with this. So let's start to place some pins here where we want to be able to edit or deform our tree here. So let's take a look. I want to bend this around a bit in here. Maybe bring this down. And now I can go in and begin to kind of change the overall shape or structure of this tree here. You can see that's giving me the freedom. If I have little pieces like this, just grab them and reattach them. Maybe bring that one in there. Let's see, maybe we'll scale this one. We'll twist that one around a little bit. Put one here and see what we can do with this. Maybe pull that and fill this area a bit over here. And any other of these little leaves, let's just reattach them. Something like that. That's fine. So we've just augmented the shape here. We've changed it a little bit. Let's maybe bring this guy up a bit and grab that little leaf and put it back. And we'll add it there. That's fine. So once I'm finished with that, I'm just going to hit my Enter key, and you can see that I've augmented or changed the shape of that quite nicely. I'm going to leave it like that. So of course, just to show, we have control over everything in here as well. Maybe we want to adjust the levels a little bit on this. Maybe darken it or lighten it up a little bit. That's fine. Now what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to hit Control E, which is the shortcut for merging that layer down with the Paint Here layer. And then the hotkey for save in Photoshop is Control S. And of course, if you go to File and hit Save, we want to overwrite the file that we're working with. So I'm going to use Control S. That's overwritten the file that we're working with back in Mudbox. And now if we come back to Mudbox, we have this connection here. It's saying that it's changed since you've exported it from Mudbox. Do you want to re-import that? Yes, I do. I want to make sure I'm on that new paint layer that I've created in there. And we'll re-import our saddle.psd. It's going to take a moment there to bring it in because, as you can see, the bubbles popped up. It's found a change, and it's reprojected that. Now, we can go back to Photoshop and continue with this, or we can continue on within Mudbox. As of Mudbox 2012 and forward, we've added a lot of tools to edit and adjust colors and textures within Mudbox. So there aren't as many reasons to go back to Photoshop. Of course, Photoshop's incredibly powerful for texture painting, so workflows like these really work well with Mudbox. I'm going to hit close on this window just to point out at any time I haven't lost this. If I move this camera around and I go back and augment or change what we've already done back in Photoshop, at any time if I come in and hit re-import from PSD or Alt-R, remember the coordinate system we saw in there, the series of numbers and letters within one of those locked layers. It's going to snap the camera back to where I want to project from. So that's really great. There's no time limit. I can close this file down and come back later and reuse that one again. It will remember the camera position. So really nice way to work with PTEX here in Mudbox. So let's work with this a little further here in Mudbox. So with that texture applied, we can do some things here, like maybe adjust the color. You can see the brown is not showing up there that much. Let's completely change the overall appearance. Let's get the saturation going in there. Maybe this kind of blue style in there. We can brighten it or darken it up a little bit, make it a little more contrasty. That's fine. So we can always hit the preview to compare to what we had in there as well. I'm just going to hit OK on that and leave that one in there. Now here's something really cool and really interesting in here. Again, we saw how we were able to take our edit stencil that we did in Mudbox and then create a bump map for it. Let's do something like that in here again. So if I duplicate this layer, I'm going to turn off the bottom layer on here, and I'm going to adjust the color down and use one of the presets here on my adjust color. At any time, any of these settings that I do in here, I can say to create my own custom preset. So I can do a new, I can edit existing presets, but anything I do in here, I can simply hit new and create my own preset in here. I can edit or update presets as well. I can import and export them so I could share them along a pipeline with other artists if need be. By default, I'm going to use this black and white setting here, and I'm just going to adjust this, the brightness and contrast on there. That's fine. And the reason why I want to do that is I'm going to create, or I'm going to move this to my bump map. Now, we can see in here a little bit of bump. Let's turn on our texture, and maybe we want to bring, actually in this case here, this is where a nice blend comes into play. Maybe something like a screen could work out well, and just tone it down a little bit just to kind of give that kind of raised relief feel on there. And then if we need to, of course, I can increase this or maybe even negative scale it. There we go, to change the overall effect of that. Now I should point out something really interesting here within Mudbox. With the normal maps here, let's go to our sculpt and turn off this top sculpt detail layer on the saddle that has all the bumps in there. If we turn on our normal maps, that's going to bring back the bump. It's a normal map PTEX generated from that sculpt. Let's take this bump map that we've just created here, and if I right click on this at any time, I can say normal map from bump. And that is really powerful. Now I'm going to turn off the bump map there. We've essentially just gone ahead and created a simple normal map based off of what we've done with our bump map there. A couple of things I can do, of course, I can tone that down if we don't want it to be so extreme. And then if I right click on there, if I right click on that layer, I can at any time here just select to solo that. Why am I clicking my button on there? There we go. So solo as diffuse, I'm going to click. And you'll see that that's going to give us a normal map preview in there. And if I hit my Alt key back on this highlighted yellow for display or visibility of layer, it'll revert everything back to what we need to do. And the GigaTextile engine, of course, will refresh here if I just zoom in and out. So there's a quick way to make or edit stencils outside of Mudbox with PTEX using Photoshop with all the power of the transformation tools available in there, and reprojecting it here back in Mudbox, preserving your camera position even if you change it, creating bump maps that you can now use as a base for an editable normal map. So very quickly I can change this again. I still have that bump map in here, or I can go back and edit this further if need be. So let's move on here and look at what we can do with what we've created. In this sense here, we've created this simple little ornate detail on the saddle, but this is a PTEX file, right? This is PTEX on our saddle in here. How can we transfer this to a UV workflow? So this is something I want to talk about before we get into the last few moments here, last few minutes of rendering PTEX over in Maya. We'll do a really quick overview on that. But here on the object list, I do have a version of the saddle, which is simply a UV laid out saddle. So if I, let's select that, go into UV view, we have these simple little UVs laid out on that saddle. Well, I want to transfer all of the texture information over to this UV version here. So this is a great workflow. I don't need to wait for UVs at all. I can paint with PTEX. Even if I do need UVs in my workflow, I can go ahead, I can move ahead and paint with PTEX, and when the model is ready, when the UV layout is signed off and ready to go, then I can transfer all that paint over there. It's more powerful than baking. This is actually transferring full art history over to the mesh. So let's look at how we can do that. Underneath the UV and Maps menu here, you'll see Extract Texture Maps. I'm going to create a new operation, and I want to click Transfer Paint Layers. Now what I want in here, I'm going to select this model here, and I'm going to use my PTEX version as my source model. I'm going to deselect that one in my viewport, and let's select our saddle, our UV saddle in there as our target model. Now, interesting to point out here, these can be completely different meshes here, and that's where I can use the ray casting method. But these are actually the same pieces of geometry. So I'm going to use the subdivision method because they are based on the same piece of geometry in here. And then what I can do for the image size, I can put it to whatever size I want. For this example, let's just leave it at 2K. And I do want all of the transfer, I want to transfer all of the paint layers over. There are no paint layers, so I can replace the existing if there were, or I can add to existing if I did have some on there. So with that all set in there, let's do an extract. And this will just take a moment here. You can see in the bottom left-hand corner the extraction process. What's happening now is it's taking a look at the PTEX mesh and all of the different channels that are there. As you can see that we had diffuse with a couple of different layers, specularity, bump, normal maps. And it's going to extract and transfer not only each channel but each layer within the channel here. So that's just going to take a moment to do that, and here we go. Let's turn off our PTEX saddle, and this is now our UV based saddle. And you can see, if I make sure that that's the active layer here, we haven't done a simple texture bake, we've done more than that. We've brought over all of the channels, all of the paint layers, and you can see this is our UV layout in here. So really simple to work with, really quick too, very fast, right? Another cool and interesting thing to point out about the transfer maps operation in here, go back into ours there, we can actually set the image size to be even much higher resolution than what we painted at. And this can work from UV to UV workflows, UV to PTEX workflows as well. In this case, we're doing PTEX to UV. I could crank that all the way up to, we have it set here at 32K. So we can crank this higher than I've actually painted that at. Something to note. So let's move forward here to the full scene and take a look at how we have this set up in Maya to render PTEX in, for this example, Mental Ray. Okay, so here you can see that we have, here's the full creature with all this gear, saddle, the reins, all the things going on, his tusks and everything. And a little bit of painting going on just to kind of get some details going on this guy. The great thing about the layers in Mudbox is the ability to build up iterations. So if I wanted to change a whole different look on this, it's very easy just to start to stack up iterations. And of course, blend them in, whether by opacity or by the blend modes here. So you can see we have all these different blend modes. We can start working with something like multiply and then maybe bring this down to give it a whole different look or effect. Anyways, let's just move forward. One of the things I wanted to show here was if we grab a whole new layer, let's bring that layer to the top, just dragging that up to the top, and I'm going to focus on in and around this eye. So I'm going to isolate the body. And if we zoom in here, we'll see that the detail's not too bad, but if I needed to get close here, you can see it's a little bit blocky. This might be an area here, part of kind of a hero section on a creature or a character that, you know, might come in contact with the camera or rendering up close. So if we wanted to add more detail in our PTEX workflow, if I step down to the bottom level, I'm going to show you another tip here underneath the preferences. I highly recommend that whenever you're working with face selection in Mudbox, go into Preferences, Render. By default, that's set to Render Selected by Vertex. Grab Face, we'll hit OK, and what that's going to allow me to do, if I hit W on my wireframe in here, we'll see that we have our faces aligned in here. You know, maybe we want to get a little more finite detail in and around these areas here. So I could take this right now, and if I come into my UV and Maps PTEX setup, again, we'll get rid of that, I can increase this local region here. I can actually increase or decrease it if I want. So you can see I'm just working with the local. If you look at the surrounding, I'm affecting only that local. I'm decreasing it, or as I said, let's increase it. Let's get it a little bit tighter in here. So maybe something like that. That's really tight. If I can get right in there nice and close on that now. So done. We'll leave that. We'll let that Ptex set up. What it needs to do here actually is, because there's existing texture there, it's going to bake that texture now into the new Ptex there, and we're going to want to do some touch-ups in here to bring up the higher res if we wanted to change the resolution of this local region here. So there we have it. I'm going to zoom out, just select anywhere in there, and let's step back up. I'm going to turn the wireframe off and step back up into our higher level subdivisions. And now we've created that new paint layer in there, and you'll see now it's baked that texture that we've painted into this area that we've created as higher res, but of course the texture was painted lower res. So you can see we would want to do some touch up in here just to show you the difference in here really quickly. If we take a simple paintbrush, let's use something bright like maybe this yellow, and if we come in and work across this region here, you'll see that we're going to get, it's a little bit blocky, and as we come in we can start to get a lot more finite detail in there. I'm actually using stamp spacing on here with an image. Let's turn off the stamp and let's get our stamp spacing back to a good default area. That's fine. So that if we're painting in here, you'll see that we're going to get a lot more fine, kind of close and tightened, refined painting in here. You can see how fine it we can get in there. So now this will allow us to do essentially local subdivision for texels or texturing, right? So think of it as subdivision in that sense. We can do a very localized subdivision or localized resolution, increase or decrease, depending on what it is that we require to do for our rendering workflow. I think that just about covers it. The one last thing I wanted to show, at any time in painting with Mudbox, you can simply grab from the marking menu here flat lighting, or underneath the display menu here you can turn on flat lighting. This is very useful for working with just that flat kind of diffuse RGB lighting, so that you're not seeing all the shading effects in there and you're just getting your true coloring. Same workflow whether you're working with UV based or Ptex. So let's now jump in and take a quick look at how we could render this in Maya. We're going to go over a really quick overview of the setup in Maya to render Ptex painting from Mudbox there. So in Maya, I want to direct you to something here first. For Maya 2014, you want to make sure that you go to your program files, your Autodesk directory here, where you'll find Maya, and look for Mental Ray for Maya 2014. This is where you want to check your RayRC file, and you want to make sure that you have this line right in here, right at the end, right after end registry. I'm going to put a blog post up on this exactly. But simply what you want to put in here is this registry entry in here that grabs this CC mesh command here for Ptex, and it turns that value on. This is a different registry here. You don't necessarily need that unless you're working with a bunch of different displacements. There was an issue with Ptex and Mental Ray with displacements there, but this is the main one here to make it work properly within the Maya environment. Once you've edited that your RC file and saved it so that that is in place, then you can begin to work with Ptex here in Maya. So here, the way we have this set up, I have my render view down below here. Here's our simple camera up top in the viewport, and what I'm using here, if you go into Mental Ray, I'm using a Ptex lookup. So if I just type MIB and then start typing Ptex, I'll get this Ptex lookup node. So let's turn that off there. And I'm bringing this in, and what's happening here in the attribute editor is I need to put the absolute path in here. I need to actually have the exact path where my map is. I'm using a 32-bit floating point Ptex file for my diffuse on this guy. I'm actually running it through a gamma. I'm doing some different filtering here with some physical sun and sky. But then it's just running into my into a default Phong here. So I'm just driving that in normally into the diffuse channel there in the color. And then as well for displacement, I'm actually using vector displacement in a Ptex format. And I'm doing the same thing with a lookup file. And I'm able to get my full file as painted from Mudbox rendered here in Maya with Mental Ray. So I'd like to spend a little more time on that in a separate forum here. I think this is a good blog post or another video as to how you can work with this in Maya with Ptex and Mental Ray, with vector displacement or any other channel there, as well as V-Ray, very similar type of setup and functionality there. So we can take a look at that at another time, but with that one addition there in your Ray RC file, you should be good to go. And then this is just simply rendering using Ptex with vector displacement and all the different other channels on there as well. So just a quick little point here, conclusion summary. Ptex provides a really fast, efficient, high-quality texturing solution for any pipeline, whether it's a Ptex pipeline or not. As we've seen, painting with Ptex, you can always translate this or transfer it over to a UV workflow quite easily. Mudbox provides a really fast and efficient, smooth painting environment for Ptex workflows. Ptex is open source, so uses are expanding. There's plenty of room for further development out there. Because it's open source, it's very easy to take this into whatever realm you may want to take it into or work with. So for reference here, ptex.us, that is the Ptex site set up from the researchers there at Disney. The paper I mentioned there by Burley and Lacewell, excellent resource. And then I have a couple other references on here if you're interested. Of course, the Mudbox 2014 help documents outlines a bunch of different parameters around working with Ptex as well for helping you out with any issues you may come across or other uses that you may be interested in. Make sure you follow me, the Mudroom, on Twitter. Everything Mudbox related on there. And as well, the Mudroom blog on the area where I post occasionally with some tips, tricks, or any announcements related to Mudbox. Any additional resources, of course, we always have different archive webcasts and demos available online, and you can download a 30-day trial of Autodesk Mudbox right now. And again, as I mentioned at the beginning, make sure you update with the patch for Service Pack 1. So thanks for attending.